Hey, everybody, Lieutenant Joe here for the Blue Heart Podcast. So today we have a former chief of police with us. This is Mark Spawn. Mark was the chief of police in Fulton City, New York. Now, one of the reasons I think Mark would be very interesting to you, he's got a bunch of different things. We're probably going to do a couple of episodes with Mark, because as a chief of police and an executive, I was a lieutenant, I was in an executive wing. There are things that from that level on up, we need to help you men and women as well. So we'll probably talk a little bit with Mark in the future about some things at that higher level. But right now, I want to get into a little bit about what he's doing since he retired. There's some interesting things here he's got going on that may involve the Blue Heart Podcast, but I think you'll find them very interesting. So Mark, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, so Mark, why don't you give us a little bit about your background? Where did you work? What did you do? You had quite a career.
Yeah, Joe, as we were saying offline, greatest career in the world, right? Loved the job. Came on the job in 1983. I worked for 5 years in patrol division. Did about 10 years in criminal investigations, where I did just a variety of violent crime, child abuse, special investigations. And then I was still fairly young and became deputy chief of police. Was deputy chief for about 6 months when the chief retired. And then I became the police chief and sat in that chair for 11 years. And this is coming from a guy who got on the job because he did not want a desk job. He wanted to be out in the field. And there I was spending 10 years in CID and 11 years
Right.
in the chief's office.
Well, I know it's interesting when you say that. When I came on the job, I came from a kind of different world, and I ended up in law enforcement. And I found that I absolutely loved the career, but my training officer was a dynamo. Retired as a captain. He was an amazing guy. And I remember working with him, and as he was so good, he got promoted to sergeant, and then he loved being a road sergeant. He really did. He was still out there. His hands were in it. Then they promoted him to lieutenant, and then he was in the office a little bit more, and then they made him the captain. And I remember walking into his office saying, "Hey, Gary, how's things being a captain? That's got to be great." And he says, "Well, I'm 3 levels removed from doing police work. Now I'm doing paperwork, and I go to meetings." And, as I started to move up in our place, we were lucky. You were a lieutenant, you could go on the road, you could stay inside, you could do all these different ancillary duties. So you could move around, but you were kind of removed from the calls, from doing things. So I kind of understand that. Amazing to move that quickly into the chief's chair, and to be there for 11 years is a long time.
It is, especially by today's standards.
They get in, guys and girls stay 3-4 years, do their main thing, what they're going to do, and then they move on and take the pension and go. So 11 years is quite a career. So what are you doing now?
So right now, and actually before right now, once I retired from the job in 2008, I became director of research and training for the Police Chiefs Association in New York State. So that allowed me to stay close with my colleagues, worked on policy, research, did some podcasts, which were mostly training and informative at that point. I wrapped that job up, even though I moved to California. I wrapped that job up in December this past year. And my wife and I have just embarked on a new true crime podcast series, and we're going to be launching that this fall. It's called APB Cold Case. And what we're doing, we're exploring unsolved murders and missing persons from across the nation. The thing that we're going to bring to the table on this is we're bringing the police insight, whether it's my CID background, my administrative background, awareness of procedures, criminal law, awareness of holdback information. We're going to bring that to our true crime series, which we don't think is necessarily there in other unsolved case podcasts.
Right.
So that's what we got going right now.
And where do you get your stories from? Where are you going to find these stories?
Well, we started in February. I started reaching out to my New York State Chief of Police colleagues. I'm also a graduate of the FBI National Academy. So through my network there, I just posted, "Hey, here's what we're doing, looking for cases." we have got a stack of cases. We are working on like probably 50 cases right now. And almost with every phone call, there's more coming in. I did put a call into NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also asked them for cases that they thought might benefit some from renewed attention. And they gave us about 10 cases. So we're working on all those. We're also working on a companion podcast series called APB Behind the Badge. Those are stories of bravery, of courage, of humanity from current and retired cops from across the nation. And they're really just good stories. They're real stories, not necessarily some of the rhetoric that has been populated in other platforms.
Right. What I like about that is, for the men and women here that are tuning in here, that are doing the job every single day. I've been around, as you have, long enough to see law enforcement in the public's view go from heroes to zeros and then back again. And right now there's a little bit of a trough, but we're seeing a little bit of a change. Excuse me. We're seeing a little bit of a change because society has kind of let it go so far, defund the police and all this other nonsense that they're doing, that now crime is getting out of control in places where completely unfunctional. You can't live. To where I'm seeing now, you're seeing some of these mayors who were the biggest, defund the police, get rid of the cops. We hate them. They're no good. Turning around saying we need to add more police. We need to get the cops back in the street, because you can't live in a society that doesn't have law and order. And what I always say all the time is, if you don't have peace and tranquility, you can't have a functioning life. And you'd only get that with proactive law enforcement activity, right? Now, people, proactive law enforcement, that means you go after people. No, what it means is you proactively look for people who are committing crime or in areas where, crime happens, and you show a presence. You see someone doing something wrong, you intervene. You don't let little things go, right? With Giuliani back in the day and his police commissioner, you get the little things, and then that slows down the bigger thing. So I think that's going to be great. Now, as far as cold cases, people love cold case information. There's actually a couple in the town that I live in that I should have you reach out and see if you can do something on them. There was a really brutal murder of a young woman here going back into the 1980s at some point. And basically, it was brutal. It's disgusting. The guy breaks into her apartment. He assaults her. She was pregnant, and he cut her stomach open. Didn't take the baby, but murdered her and left her there. And it's never been solved. So at the time, there was this. I remember the conversation going around that it was the man on the train, because apparently some guy she used to go to New York every day for work. There was a guy on the train that always gave her a lot of attention. But one of the things that I know from my years of investigating, as you know, I'm sure, that is way above and beyond an assault murder, where somebody goes in, assaults somebody, and then kills them in the course of it. To actually cut someone open was amazing. And as part of my training in my detective career, I went to a course on cold case homicides, and they talked about that, and they had pictures of the crime scene. And unfortunately, back in the day, investigation wasn't as sophisticated. There was no DNA. There was they showed you a toilet bowl with cigarette butts in it, and they're like, was that the cops smoking on the scene and throwing the cigarettes? They never took a sample of that water. So this young lady is moldering away in a grave, and we never found out who she is, or what happened to her. So maybe that's something I could pass that information on. Maybe you could look into that.
Please do, Joe. I'll tell you, some of the best cases that were getting referred to us are coming from the cops.
Yeah.
In fact, just before we started our call, I got a call from an agency up in Northern California, and it's a case that we thought would be an interesting case. They don't want to talk about it right now because they got something going on it. But he's like, you know what? I got another case for you. In fact, one of the cases that we will be dropping this fall came from a guy that I knew back in New York State. He's now a retired state trooper. And I never knew this from our conversations, but when I launched my email saying, looking for cold cases, he sent me this really deep message that his wife, basically it's his brother-in-law that he never knew, was murdered back in the, I think it's 1980, early 80s, and never solved. And when the investigating agency VICAP'd that case, they got an association of one in Utah, 2,000 miles away.
That's great.
And ballistics connect the dots. Now, there's probably 4 or 5, maybe more similar homicides and a bunch of them in New Jersey that also might be connected. So we put that story together, and that's going to be one of them. It's going to be called the Interstate 80 Hitchhiker Murders. And
Excellent.
we interview the one of the slain men's sisters. She has fond memories, and I got to tell you, it's great to engage family members. It's a tightrope walk for us because you don't want to resurrect a bunch of bad feelings and angst with the families. But one of the things that I'm noticing as we're doing this, both my wife and I, we are the team on this, that people are grateful that time hasn't lost attention
Yes,
to their
sure.
loved one. They really like that.
Imagine if somebody in your family had been murdered and it went nowhere, and then years go by and no one's still looking at it. So when we look across the country, the advent of DNA, as DNA gets better and better, we see what a powerful tool this is for people that are in jail that were not guilty, and they're getting out. But how many cases you see every day? Cold case matched up to a guy who's now 72 years old and he raped and murdered a girl in 69. I mean, you're seeing it every single day. There was another one here when you talk about that VICAP. I was really surprised because when you see one of the things I talk about in a couple of my books and my training is the victim, the scene can tell you a lot about the mindset of the person who did it. All right, so you and I get into a fist fight, and we start to get stupid, and I pull a knife and stick you, and you die. Okay, that's a bad thing. When I go in and I dissect you, I cut you up, I carve my initials into you, I do all this weird stuff and dump you in the woods. That is way down the road. That is a whole different mindset. So there was a girl in the town where I worked, and she was a prostitute, and she was a heavy, heavy drinker, a young girl in her 30s, but she was just a mess. And she used to stand at the driveway of the hotel where she lived with her boyfriend, and she'd flag down cars, for prostitution. And one day, we all arrested her 20 times for stumbling in the road drunk. We'd arrest her and send her out the door. And then the boyfriend comes in one time and reports her missing. She didn't come home. She's a prostitute and she always comes home. She didn't come home. So, of course, we did our invest and make sure he's not the guy. And that was it. About 3 or 4 weeks later, down in the Pine Barrens, which is 40 miles away from where this girl was living, a motorcycle guy, they ride motorcycles in the Pine Barrens here. It's all dirt out there and they're having a good time. They come across a pile of brush, and underneath it is this girl. Not only is she murdered, she's dissected. Her sexual organs were cut out and taken with the killer. There were burns all over her body. This is not somebody who just got mad at a prostitute.
Yeah.
This is someone who exacted some real punishment on this person. And we put this out, and not another word. And there's no way this is the first time the person did it.
Right.
It might have been the last because they died or went to prison, but that wasn't their first time. So that this person is still out there. So there's these two cold cases that I'll pass on your way, but that's excellent. And for the Blue Heart podcast here, we're trying to work something out with Chief Spawn here, that maybe we can get some of his shows up on our YouTube platform and here on the Podbean platform. So I think that's excellent.
Yeah, and we're glad to share those with you. And one of the things you alluded to in your case, and when I mentioned the Interstate 80 hitchhiker murders being connected, in both cases, both victims were castrated and genitals not found at the scene. So you talk about some of this really eccentric behavior. These are not first-time killers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So very interesting. Couple of plugs I want to put in here, Chief. Well, I got you here. So the Blue Heart podcast, we're trying to get to all the men and women of law enforcement, sheriff's departments, corrections, police, federal, everybody. We have some sponsors for the program that are really pro law enforcement. So one of them is Medical Essential Diagnostics. Now, what's great is that they are an organization with 5 offices in New Jersey. Anybody, it's a public service job, not just law enforcement, but anybody in the state of New Jersey can go to them. Whatever insurance you have, you put it down. Any bills that are left after that are paid by the organization. You get soup to nuts. You're there for 8 hours, and they check you for every kind of health problem, give you beautiful reports, and they sponsor us because they want to help law enforcement. And the other one is my publisher, Blue 360 Media. Blue 360 Media is the national publisher. They publish in every single state, and they support us here, and I'm very happy to have them. But when we're talking about these homicides and what this is my latest book, The Investigation, from Blue 360. And in that book, what I did is I took the story of a very brutal homicide, double homicide that took place, and I used that as the background for the training. So I teach you, the guy went from here to the killing scene. How could you have tracked him if you were the investigator? And I talk about what he did, how he killed everyone, the brutality of the crime. And then, hey, if you're the investigator, here's what you should be looking at. And then the trial, how to prepare and go through a trial. Well, one of the things I wrote about in there is the difference between a want crime and a need crime. Now, this is something that I've seen over the course of time. A want crime is the kind of thing where, I want money to pay for drugs. I want money to pay for booze. I want money to buy electronics, whatever. But if the consequences are too high for me to do it, gee, I'm going to do burglaries, but somebody might see me. I can put my want off. A drive criminal are these people we're talking about doing these brutally horrific things to people. They might be able to slow themselves down, but they can't stop. That drive is too powerful. And it's usually psychosexual killers. The sex is not about sex, it's about power. And how do you more control another human being than to sexually assault them and then murder them at your pace? Right. So that's what the book, The Investigation, is about. And when you're talking about these cold cases, I find them so interesting. If you were to tell our audience right now that's out there, these police officers and sheriff's officers, what are a couple of things you see in common with a cold case that helps break the case? Is there any 1, 2, 3 things that you notice investigators stumble on, or do they go back and re-interview? Is that where it is, or is it evidence? What would you tell them to look for?
Joe, I will tell you, it's perseverance. I've looked at cold cases, some of them that we haven't adopted into production just because there's not a lot there. The ones that we're profiling, we have got some agencies that are doing all the right things all the time, not giving up. Even when the leads run out, they're on it. Mm-hmm. It's the perseverance. It really is. When something goes cold and you run out of what we call solvability factors, if you rest on that just because you check the box, it's not really doing a service for justice and for the families, for the victims. So what we're noticing is it's the agencies that persevere, who think outside the box. One of the cases that we have is from Bensalem, Pennsylvania, a detective who picked up a cold case, and it was a cold case for him, I think, in 1992. But DNA wasn't what it was when this 14-year-old girl first went missing. Mm-hmm. 14-year-old girl goes missing. 7 months later, her mom is missing. And the boyfriend of mom ends up getting arrested. The boyfriend of mom is the last one who took that 14-year-old to school 7 months earlier. Mm-hmm. In Bensalem, the police get a call of a body found in an old industrial underground well. Now, at the time it's found, DNA really required a good sample, and they weren't going to get it off of skeletal remains. This thing was so cold that over the years, DNA technology kept advancing. We got mitochondrial DNA. They can use a lesser sample. They can work with a hair, where back when this girl went missing, it wasn't possible. Mm-hmm. So the technology really advanced. And the neat thing with that story from Bensalem, Pennsylvania, this body that's recovered from a well, they thought for sure, the detective that I spoke with was going to bet money. I would have bet money. This is going to be Tracy Byrd. It wasn't. They got DNA from Tracy Byrd's family. He was shocked when it didn't come back. Other detectives suggested, well, you know what? There was another missing girl from their same city. He goes and grabs DNA from that girl's brother. They get a hit, but the hit is not to the girl found in the well. It's to an unsolved homicide in New Jersey that was a Jane Doe.
Unbelievable.
So anyway, this case goes on, and we actually end up with 3 productions out of this, because finally it turns out to be the body of Lisa Todd from Philadelphia. And unfortunately, Philly PD, when this girl had turned 18, she went missing at age 16, I believe. I'm sorry, she went missing at age 17. When she turned 18, they purged her record from NCIC just because she had turned 18. She was still missing. There was nothing validating that she had ever been found. And when she went missing, she was 6 months pregnant. So it's this story, we delve into the weeds on these, and there's really some great stories, as the one I just mentioned to you, where DNA technology just really evolves. And when we're talking about cold cases, a lot of our listeners, we try to frame everything up that, you might be thinking that, gee, why didn't the cops do DNA? Well, depending on where you were in the 80s, it may or may not have been a thing. You may have required a substantial sample, a good sample, to get any good DNA
Sure.
profile. But again, things change. People might be asking, well, where's all the video footage that, on these things? Over the past 10 years, video technology has just proliferated. In my home alone, there's probably 5 to 10 different camera views between doorbells and outside cameras
Sure.
that, and every house has got them. So it's hard to travel around today without being caught on camera. But just wind the clock back 10, 20, 30 years, that wasn't necessarily the case
No,
in all these
didn't
cold cases.
exist. Didn't
Yeah.
exist at all. Chief, that's very interesting. So what's the name of the two podcasts again?
So it's a APB Cold Case, where we're featuring the unsolved murders and missing persons, and APB Behind the Badge.
And how does somebody reach out to you? Where would we find this when it's up and going? How do we know it's going to happen? I'm going to announce it first of all, but besides that, how can
Certainly,
people find you?
our website is apbcoldcase.com, and we will be on all major podcast platforms as soon as we launch this fall.
That's outstanding. One of the things I can say, perseverance is a good point of view for the officers that are out there working the road, working the street. One of the things I found is detail. Pay attention to detail when you're taking a report. One of the things we went through in our county, that's a pretty big county here, is that they used to send detectives out to all suicides. And then after a while, the county prosecutor said, we have all these detectives and they're busy. They can't be going out to a suicide. So they did some training on suicide and this, and then you had officers going out and the county wouldn't come. The local detective would go out. And, sometimes you have bigger towns like mine that have very experienced detectives, and then you had small towns that didn't have a lot of experience. And you always worried that, somebody would go out and miss something. And one of the things that I always tell the story about with a cold case, we had an elderly man who was bedridden for years, and his older son was taking care of him. And it was very stressful. It wasn't about money. It was so stressful taking care of him that he ended up pillowing his father out, right? And nobody caught that. They showed up. Here's an old man. There's his jewelry. There's his medicine, and he's dead. They call the medical examiner. Oh, okay, everything's there. Okay, ship him off. The only way we found out was later on, a couple of years later, this guy comes in and he goes, listen, I want to tell you, I can't live with this. I found out I have this cancer. I'm going to die. I killed my father. And what do you mean? Well, he pilled him out. Well, you start to say to yourself, how many of those cases do officers go to every day where they're not trained to look for petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes? They look at an old person laying there. Oh, well, the old person died. There's their medicine and nobody's robbed them or anything. And off they go. So it's detail. My point is that it's detail when you look at these things, and these cold cases are absolutely amazing because there's a lot of evidence, things we can do now that we couldn't do then. And Chief, I'm looking forward to your podcast. I will make sure that in the description of our episode here, when you go to look, I'll have the Chief's information, how you can get that. And when that podcast is up and running, we're hoping to run it here on the Blue Heart podcast. So Chief, I want to thank you very much for being here today. It was really very interesting. And having talked to you before we got started, there's a ton more things we have to talk about. So we'll be in touch in the future.
My pleasure, Joe.